Embroidery has long been seen as a gentle, feminine pastime, which is one reason why it's often left out of historical narratives. But embroidery can also be a powerful act of rebellion. It can be a way to tell stories and build connections across generations. The history of embroidery can tell us much about gender, race, class, and how society worked. Even more so if we're thinking of works made by incarcerated people. From coded messages stitched in prisons to psychiatric hospitals, people on the margins of history have turned to embroidery, giving historians an entry point into their lives. So today we're uncovering this rich and often overlooked history with Dr. Isabella Rosner, a historian dedicated to bringing these stories to light. Dr. Rosner is curator of the Royal School of Needlework. She's a research associate at Witney Antiques, and she's the host of the popular So What podcast, in which she explores the often forgotten narratives behind historical needlework. Plus, how great is that name for a podcast? I love it. Anyway, so forget the image of a bored Victorian lady doing her needlework by the fire. Together, we'll discuss how embroidery has been an act of rebellion, how it shaped identity, and how it helped people survive. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like and subscribe and consider supporting the channel on Patreon. It truly does help. And both Pancake and me were both very grateful. Now, let's discover the fascinating stories stitched throughout history. So, hello, Dr. Rosner, and thank you so much for speaking with me today. I recently read your book. Here it is, Stitching Freedom, Embroidery and Incarceration. And I have lots of questions. But I thought we could maybe start by talking a little bit about how embroidery has been perceived throughout the centuries, just because I know that many of us, I think many people they have this image of embroidery as a kind of like kind, gentle, feminine hobby that women with lots of time might dedicate themselves to. But in your book, you explore how embroidery can be political, how it can be a form of resistance, how it can be a way for people to, especially people who were marginalized or persecuted in a way, to sort of own and tell their own stories. So could you tell us a little bit about how this reductive idea of what embroidery is in terms of like being a docile craft? How did this start, basically?
Good question. So you're right when you say that embroidery has been perceived as something gentle and submissive. Gentle is really the good word because for a long time it's been called the gentle craft or the gentle art. And Rosika Parker, in her seminal book, The Subversive Stitch, talks a lot about that and about how embroidery has historically been oftentimes about submission, that you have to, be concentrating when you're embroidering. So you're going to be quiet. Your head is bent. There's this body language and kind of behavior around gentleness and submission when it comes to stitch and how it's been perceived. Yeah, embroidery has.
I had never thought of the posture, how your body language is when you're stitching. That's so interesting.
It is really interesting. I think that she is right when she says, there is a kind of body language of submission there, but I also think that it can be more than that too. Like in my PhD, I talk about how I perceive this kind of bent over posture as, at least for these Quaker girls that I was researching my PhD, totally unrelated to Stitching Freedom. It reminds me, in their case, of reading a Bible. These are religious women, and like you would be bent over in prayer reading your Bible, you are bent over kind of focusing on your needle and thread. And I like that because it makes embroidery feel like worship. And
that's interesting. I had never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's too like lovey-dovey of me, but embroidery, it's not always worship all the time, but I like that idea of, for some people, embroidery has the capacity to be an object of affection and love and interest, and that it's not about the end product, but about the process itself. That's a total tangent, but embroidery as this thing that's been gentle and tied to femininity likely comes from the fact that for many centuries, especially in places like Europe, embroidery has been women's work primarily. not exclusively. Men have been professional embroiderers and non-professional embroiderers as well. But for so long, embroidery has been usually the purview of women. It's been tied to, not only gender, but also race, class, religion, socioeconomic status. It's part of why embroidery has been kind of relegated to the sidelines. I think it's not at all on the same level of painting, and that's because it's women's work.
Yeah.
And I say that in quotation marks, but also in reality, it's tied to the work of the hands of women who are oftentimes anonymous, and women and girls who are not always the fanciest people or the names that we know over the course of history. This is a really rambly answer, but basically,
but it's exactly what I wanted to know, because I think for people who are interested in the history of women like we are, and it's so frustrating sometimes to know so little, to have the sources be so limited. And I think with embroidery in general, if you bring that into like the big narrative, it can add so much. And this idea of it not being as important is just, I think it's just really misleading, and we should just get rid of it.
Yeah.
And that brings me to my first question about the people in the book. That if we're thinking of embroidery as a sort of something small and domestic and private, not connected to the bigger world, how wrong that can be, because you start off the book with, and it's one of my favorite cases in the book, about how Mary, Queen of Scots, when she was imprisoned. So I think most of us familiar with her story, but she came to be imprisoned by Queen Elizabeth, and she was perceived to be a threat to the throne, especially as Elizabeth was growing older and didn't have an heir, right? And so Mary, Queen of Scots, remained, I think, for nearly 2 decades imprisoned, right, until she was eventually executed in 1587. And I know that by looking at her work, at her embroidery, it's very cute in a way. But like the embroidery she did of her dog, I think that's really lovely.
Yeah.
But there's lots of politics there as well. So I was wondering, what could you tell us about Mary's embroidery?
Sure. So yes, Mary was imprisoned under the Earl of Shrewsbury and his wife, Bess of Hardwicke, for 15 years. And during that time, she embroidered. She had always been a passionate needlewoman, and Bess of Hardwicke was also a passionate needlewoman. So they embroidered together, and Mary's written correspondence was surveyed and kind of policed. And so she took to embroidery to relay her feelings, to express sentiments that she didn't feel able to express with a pen. And so she and Bess embroider a huge number of, I guess I would call them medallions. They're usually quatrefoil shaped standalone pieces, emblems, and some square ones as well as some other items. But those kind of quatrefoil and square shaped motifs are the things that I'm most interested in. She is spending her time embroidering things like animals from around the world. So she's taking her inspiration from books like Conrad Gessner's Book of Emblems, and she is depicting things like a cat, which she spells Catte. Love it, because there's no spelling regulation back then. And she is taking these images that she has seen in books and making them her own. And so she depicts this cat that is black and white in the book. She makes the cat orange, and she adds a crown and poses next to the cat a little gray mouse. And it's been perceived to be that she is positioning herself as the innocent, small, little gray mouse, and that her cousin, Elizabeth I, who has all the power, is the cat that's chasing her. And so I think Mary's embroidery just is awesome in so many ways. But as somebody who's really interested in embroidery and code, her stitching is really apt. She is using her literacy and her access to print culture to craft a narrative about her experience that many people wouldn't understand the language of unless they too were attuned to things like the print culture of the time. I don't know if that makes sense, but I guess it's about it's about this shared language, the shared language of stitch. Everybody, at this time can do these tent and cross stitches, but it's also about understanding what she's meaning when she creates some seemingly innocent imagery. And there's this example that I think is really really representative of this. It's this square piece, and it has a hand coming down from the heavens holding a pruning knife, and it says "Vulnere verescit virtu." I don't know. I can't remember off the top of my head right now because I unfortunately do not speak Latin, but it basically says virtue flourishes by wounding, and the hand is leading towards like a fruiting grapevine. And what she is saying is, man, wouldn't it be better if the crown was under me, this fertile lady who has children, instead of this childless spinster? And that's so interesting in that she's using embroidery to express these feelings, but you do have to kind of dig deeper to understand what she's meaning here. People could perceive it as just a heavenly hand pruning a grapevine, but it's the combination of language and imagery of word and image that leads to this kind of revelation of what she's actually getting at.
And do we know about her relationship with Bess Hardwick? Because if they were embroidering together, presumably talking and discussing things, do we know anything about Bess's work? I know they worked together, but like what?
Bess of Hardwick herself was a very, very passionate textilian. She embroidered throughout her life, but she also commissioned professional embroideries and tapestries and everything in between. And Hardwick Hall is just like wall-to-wall textiles, and it speaks to her self-fashioning and her ability to express herself and her place in the world through fabric.
And so thinking of this idea of self-fashioning and agency and creating sort of your own narrative, but in a way also escaping, I'm trying to think how many of these themes they appear, like they're recurring themes throughout the book in many of the cases you mentioned. And that brings me to the second person I was really interested in the book, because I know there are 12 people and I only chose 6 for us to talk about today because otherwise, it would be too long of a video. But
we'd be here all day.
Yeah, but I was so interested in Annie Parker because she's the opposite of Mary Queen of Scots, I think, in the sense that we know so very little about her, don't we? We don't have there's a paucity of sources. We don't have many documents about her. But you do mention in the book that she had been arrested over 400 times, I think, before she died, sadly, at just 38 years old. So, which felt to me, reading the story, it felt very Dickensian. And and I think it says a lot about morality in the Victorian era, just the horror of workhouses, and she suffered from consumption and all of that. So it sounds very Victorian, very Dickensian. But another thing that I found so interesting, and I wanted to ask you about that, was the idea that the materials she was using to embroider, to make her art, she used her own hair as thread, didn't she? And so I was thinking about that. Why do you think that is? Was it very difficult for people to have access to stitching materials, to needles and threads and all of that? Was that regular? Do we know anything about that? Because I know that happens with others as well. What could you tell us about Annie Parker and using hair as thread?
It's a good question. So I don't know what her access to material was. And I should say that for everybody in this book, the relationship they have to material and accessibility is different. It seems that some people were given stuff, some people had to kind of pilfer or, use other objects to create canvas and thread. With Annie, it's unclear. My theory is that because she was stitching these objects for people who are in the carceral system and kind of people who are high up, and she was known for these pieces of embroidery, I believe she was probably getting these materials, being given them. The hair, my theory then is that it's not out of necessity, but out of something, this other drive, this desire. I think it's tied to part of it is tied to the Victorian interest in hair work, I believe. It is not coming out of just the Victorian era, this idea of creating bracelets and pictures and pieces and 3D dioramas out of your loved one's hair. That's not a new concept in the 19th century, but in the Victorian era, it
was
takes
very
on a
popular.
whole different. Yeah, it gets big, and I think that perhaps her use of hair is partially tied to that interest more generally. But I tend to think, and this might be too much of me romanticizing her, but I think it's about flagellation, kind of the self-flagellation of punishing herself for her crimes, for this. And I say crimes, they're not crimes.
I was going to ask, what were her crimes? Do we know?
So she was arrested mostly for drunkenness, for public drunkenness. She would sometimes cause a public nuisance, but she was clearly an addict in a society that did not know how to deal with a person who was sick like that. And you could tell from the needlework and also from these really sensationalized newspaper articles about her that she was not having a good time. She was a victim of her own self and circumstances. She did not want to be drunk all the time. She, would tear at her own clothing. She went to America briefly to try to be a lady's maid to get out of the situation. But there are instances where she leaves prison and is met by her friends who immediately hand her a drink, like immediately. And she is just in this terrible, unfortunate cycle. And I tend to feel that her use of hair is about taking a piece of herself to try to build herself better. The part of it might be practical. It's her hair that's falling out when she's brushing it, but I think also she's probably plucking from her own scalp. There's pain that comes with that. There's this, I don't know, kind of giving a piece of herself to God. She's very pious. All of her needlework is about how this life is really unfortunate, but she will, in heaven, things will be better. And she's really lonely and she has no friends, but thy will be done. She constantly is stitching thy will be done and all of these hymns. And it feels like by using a piece of herself, she's giving herself to something better, bigger after that. She's trying to stitch herself better in the present, but also is giving a token of herself to the future, to the afterlife, I think. But she's not the only one. I should say she's not the only one who uses hair to embroider as tied to incarceration. Interestingly, there's an example from the 1730s in the London Museum of a woman who embroiders a bed sheet after her husband is executed at the Tower of London. And so there maybe is something there about hair as memory, hair as, another level of the personal, of it's not just you talking about how much you're messing up and how the next life will be better, but about how you are, everything hurts. You're taking a piece of yourself with every new stint in prison. I don't know. That's how it feels to me, at least.
That is so interesting. And I love this idea of using something so material and bodily to connect with the transcendent, with God. I think that's incredible. And in many other stories as well, there's this idea, I think, of connection through embroidery, which makes sense when you're literally putting two things together, right? Two materials to, and it made me think of I think the most moving story from the book, and there are many cases, many people you mentioned who have tragic stories, and and Annie Parker is definitely one of them. I think it's so sad when you think about it that she could have had help in a different context, and but I was thinking about moving from connection to God to this idea of connecting people to each other through embroidery, and not only community but family. And one of the, well, I think there are two objects completely found by chance in the book that have survived, by sheer luck. And so I wanted to ask you about Ashley's sack, as from what I understood, this was very much found by chance, by luck.
Yep.
And it's a beautiful, heartbreaking object with a very sad story. And I wanted to ask you about race and slavery, because I imagine that there aren't too many artifacts that survived, that have been stitched by enslaved people whose names we know, whose identity we know. I'm sure there's much invisible labor that has been done that is now anonymous, and as Virginia Woolf said, anonymous was often a woman. So I think that's very much the case with some of these objects. But I wanted to ask you about this object because it's from the 1850s, right? The sack itself. But it was embroidered in the 1920s. So I was thinking about this idea of embroidery connecting the past and the present and different generations in a family to each other, because I think this artifact, it's so sad when you know the story behind it. The idea that there was a mother who enslaved mother whose daughter was sold, and then this girl grows up and she has her own family, and then it's the granddaughter many generations later who's embroidering the sack that survived. So I was wondering about all these themes of history, memory, intergenerational trauma, and love, and how they all come together in this object. So what could you tell us about this?
Yeah, Ashley's
It's a big
sack
question.
that is a big question, but it's a good one. Ashley's sack is a really rare object when it comes to the material culture of enslavement, in that there are objects made by enslaved individuals. When it comes to fashion and textiles, there are surviving garments that were made under enslaved labor and all that sort of stuff. But when it comes to embroidery that is about, like, that has a written narrative about enslavement, it's pretty much stands alone. And you're right, it's a story of a mother and a daughter being forcibly separated, the daughter and mother never seeing each other again, and the granddaughter being taking this object that had been passed down through the family and writing the story through stitch on the object. And it is a story of connection and love despite systems of incarceration. And I am including enslavement in that because that is a prison system. It's about being able to tell stories orally that then get written down. Incarceration, imprisonment, they're really lonely systems. They're isolating. And yet with this object, we see how love and human connection and family kind of overrules that despite being in a system that is so demeaning and violent and lonely making, that stories can survive, and they survive in this instance and in many other instances through women. It's networks of women here. And I should say that is so much of embroidery history generally. I made an effort to talk about men and women in this book because I also feel that embroidery is universal, and to only talk about women's stories disregards the embroidery stories of men. But I should say that so much of embroidery history is about women's connections to each other, whether they're familial or friend-based or purely strangers. There are connections here, even with the fact that this sack was found at a flea market by a woman. She could have been a man, but
So was that it was found at a flea market?
Yeah, it was found at a flea market in the early 2000s. And it was given to a historic plantation called Middleton Place because the woman who stitched upon the bag, the story, Ruth Middleton, the person who bought it at the flea market thought that Ruth Middleton would have been tied to Middleton Place. And that ended up being the case. But Middleton Place acquired the object, and now it's on long-term loan to the one of the national museums, maybe National Museum of African American History, one of the national museums in the US. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. But it ended up there by chance and by somebody recognizing at a flea market that this thing was significant. And giving it to the only, to the place they could think of as being relevant. That is a theme throughout this zine of people finding things by chance and objects luckily being found by people who have an interest or at least a feeling that these things are more significant than being in kind of a junk pile at a flea market. Briefly going back to Annie Parker, when I wrote this article after the release of the book about Annie Parker, where I expanded a bit on her story, and somebody messaged me on Instagram being like, oh my gosh, I think we have one of those in my house. My mom got it at the Portobello Road Market in London.
Oh my God.
In the 90s. And I was like, okay, send me a photo. And they did. And it's an Annie Parker piece.
Really?
And it was found at a flea market. That's a third story here of these pieces of embroidery that were made in incarceration that people happen to be finding by chance. And it tends to be women, because not to get gendered about it, but women are the people who have historically been made to embroider and who have embroidered and who, are embroidering today primarily, not exclusively, but primarily, and they remember their moms and their grandmothers stitching. And there is a legacy here of the people who find these things at flea markets tend to be people who not necessarily know what they're looking at, but at least have a sense of the value of stitch. And that is really lucky and fortunate that these things can survive because people, happen to be able to pull them out of piles of lots of different scraps.
And it's so interesting to think that someone else connected through Instagram and told you about, like, it's just
I don't know if I actually ever said this to anybody other than like one of my bosses. Like, I'm pretty sure that I've not said this publicly. So congrats to you all on hearing this new information.
But that is just so cool. And again, it's like thinking of social media in general as sort of bringing people together, when I think, when it's used for good, when good things come of it, it's just incredible.
Yeah, human connection. It's interesting that it continues the cycle of human connection that is so present in the embroidery itself. It does haunt me slightly to know that, these pieces were found by luck and by people who, end up really valuing these pieces. But it does make me wonder how many things have been lost because they end up in the bin because nobody's known what they are looking at, or they're at flea markets and, they get tossed aside because everybody's like, whatever.
I think,
don't care about this thing.
Especially when the materiality is not obviously valuable in terms of it's not made of gemstones or gold, or it's not illuminated like medieval manuscript or something like that. It's the problem I always have with recipe books, because they're also something that is so common that people don't necessarily see the value in them. But we know they can tell powerful stories. And
all tied to gender and race. And it's all, it's art versus craft. It's the fact that these sorts of paper-based materials and needlework materials are oftentimes, again, relegated to the sidelines, and therefore they're not valued when people see them. It's a whole cursed cycle.
The whole debate for sure. But I think it's inevitable that you would think that, these are so such lucky finds, but then how many things were not found and were thrown out with the brush. Anyway, but speaking of finding things by chance, I wanted to ask you about another object that survived like this, and that's the Suffragette handkerchief. And because there's so many interesting stories that we could explore, but I think that this one is so special because this, again, survived by pure chance. It was found by chance. And what I found so interesting is that it was embroidered with, I think, around 60 signatures of suffragettes who had been imprisoned. And that was following the 1922 Women's Social and Political Union demonstrations, which we know were very big. There was a lot of window smashing, and many women were imprisoned. And we know how horrific was the treatment that they received in prison, with being force-fed when they were doing hunger strikes and all of that. And that made me think that this handkerchief, this object with all the signatures, maybe it was a way of them remembering each other. I'm not suffering alone. I'm part of a community. We are suffering together for this joint shared cause that we are all fighting for. So I was thinking about this idea of, because I think Ashley Sack is so much about family. And I think the Suffragette Handkerchief is so much about community. And of course, there's a lot of overlap, but I was thinking about this idea of connecting and community through this object. So could you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the suffragette embroideries that were being made in this period between 1912 and 1914. And something I didn't talk about in this book, but is something that I should talk about here because we're talking about community and community building, is that these objects seem to me to come out of this Victorian and Edwardian trend of autographomania, this idea of collecting signatures, autographs from your friends and family, but also from like celebrities. There are quite a few examples that survive of things like tablecloths and bed covers and banners and these objects that are covered in embroidered signatures. And usually they're, commemorating a dinner party or one random woman's social network or like her favorite celebrities. But this is about, a massive historical event that changes the lives of women forever, hopefully.
Yeah. Hopefully.
And hopefully. And it's about, exactly that community and memory. And I think it's about saying, hey, I was here, but also all these other people were here and we did this together. Again, embroidery has some imprisonment has kind of connotations of isolation. Embroidery can also have connotations of isolation in that you are working with your head down. Oftentimes you're working in silence or with your TV on in the background. People think about embroidery as a solitary craft or art form, but they shouldn't, because historically embroidery has been a very social thing as well. All sorts of textile production have been social activities. And it feels like that these objects mix together so many of these different factors. It's about the trend of autographomania that's happening at this time. It's about embroidery as a social network, especially amongst women. It's about memory and how to preserve the fact that this thing happened and I was there and all these other people were also there. I think these objects are perfect for encapsulating all of those things because they are foldable, they're transportable, you're passing them around a prison cell maybe, or afterwards when you're all getting together at somebody's house. It's not heavy. You can just put it in a little purse or your pocket and tell a whole story with an object that's really easily moved and migrated. And I think that's the power of not only these sorts of objects, but about textiles generally, is stories have been able to be told and ideas exchanged and people moved around the world with textiles because they were so transportable. You could carry so many stories on a piece of fabric that can be folded really easily.
And more resistant, I would imagine, than, just paper, right? It's something that can survive better. But just thinking of all the signatures, how big is this handkerchief? Like, I'm trying to imagine something like, I don't know,
like this. I've never seen this one in real life. I've seen the other pieces that are at places like the London Museum, and they vary in size massively. And so you have things that are really small scale, like little purses. And you have banners, like there's a banner that's usually on display at the London Museum that is much bigger. And because it's a handkerchief, I would assume it's a handkerchief size, kind of like like a foot long square.
So very portable then. You could easily fold it and put it in your pocket.
Yeah, and how interesting is it? I hadn't thought about this until right now, but we're talking about the fact that it's a handkerchief. How interesting is it that a handkerchief is, usually considered this very delicate item. It's made out of light, finely woven fabric, and oftentimes these things are embroidered with little flowers, and you use a handkerchief sometimes when you're emotional. These are items that, handkerchiefs are not limited to just women, but I think they have a lot of feminine connotations. And what does it mean then to take this object tied up in, I don't know, the female experience, not exclusively, but oftentimes, and use it to commemorate an event that was tied up with violence. I talk about that in the book, I think, where it's, this they're doing these violent acts, but then they're doing the supposedly gentle type of needlework afterwards. And it's turning violence on its head, but it's also turning the gentleness and kind of fragility of needlework on its head as well. And I think that it shows then that, well, it just makes everything, what am I trying to say? Shows us that needlework can be and should be sometimes tied to violence and discomfort and the bad things in life, that to limit our understanding of embroidery to just rainbows and butterflies and, home sweet home is really limiting for what embroidery can and has done for people.
Definitely. And I also think that, like, the fact that it's a handkerchief, I think it has all these connotations you mentioned, but it's also something, it's so intimate, right? It's an intimate kind of textile. It's not something, it's very private, it's very connected to your body, to your face, like you said. And that brings me to the next object that I wanted to ask you about, that I feel is also very intimate in a way, even though it's not about one individual. And again, thinking of this idea of family ties, but also of resistance. I wanted to ask you about Ethel Mulvany. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly.
I don't know.
Ethel Mulvany.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about, like, the women who were imprisoned with her in Singapore after the Japanese occupation in 1942. So just for quick context, when Singapore surrendered, people who were from Britain, Canada, Indonesia, all kinds of places, they were put into camps, right? And they were missionaries, teachers, doctors, all kinds of people. But the families were separated, right? And so the children, I think young children stayed with their mothers, and older boys with their fathers, and there should be no contact between the men's camp and the women's camp. And the case of this quilt that you describe in the book is, so Ethel, this woman, she found a way essentially for the two camps to communicate through this quilt, right? Through this patchwork object with coded messages in Changi prison. So what could you tell me about what do we know about these patches that form the quilt, about the messages that the women were sending their husbands?
So there were 3 quilts, and each one was covered. Yeah, each one was covered in these patches that a woman would make. And oftentimes they would have her name or symbols of patriotism. But the pieces that are of interest to me are the patches that work as code and tell the men, their family members on the other side of these camps, that they were alive and well, and that something in their lives had changed. So there's this patch that has a blue rabbit on it. And that is because this woman was pregnant. And she's telling her husband, I have had the baby and the baby's a boy. And in the midst of all of these images that are purposefully depicted to not receive any sort of criticism or, suspicion, that there are images that are about things that have changed, and they're basically updates. They're like a text message, I guess. These quilts were given to men who were convalescing in the barrack hospitals, and they were the ones who spread the messages beyond just that space to the other men in the camps. And I think that we, myself included, cannot comprehend how much code there is in these quilts, because you can see those things like the blue rabbit and be like, okay, yeah, I am understanding that you have had a great life change and you're updating your husband. But I think that there are further levels of code and secrecy in these images that seem pretty innocent as well. Like lots of British flags, lots of images of Scotland, like thistles, and it's all of these patriotic images. And I think that anybody who sees them would say, this person is just feeling really patriotic. But that's a big deal in a situation where you are being held in a camp against your will, and your country is the enemy of the people who are holding you there. But I think there's probably more levels of code than I know that we can see. It's this idea that I mentioned earlier when talking about Mary Queen of Scots, about a shared language. And these were people who were all in a situation 80 years ago in a place far away that meant that the symbols that they chose, even if they seem innocent to us, likely had deeper, further meaning to the people who were on the receiving end of those images than we can understand. I like that. It's one of the things that keeps me going with embroidery generally is embroidery tells us a lot about a lot of people, but there are many things that remain kind of elusive. You can see a sampler, for example, and you know somebody's name and maybe the year and where they were and what threads they had access to and all of that stuff, but we don't know how they felt. And here as well, we don't know how they felt. We don't know. There are symbols here that relate something that we cannot perceive anymore. And it's that level of mystery that I think keeps me going, not only with those quilts, but with embroidery generally. I just want to find out all the answers all the time. And I won't, but I would like to think that one day I will.
But I think, yeah, and I wonder the men reading the quilts, the men reading the coded messages, I wonder how much they would have understood, because if it's the men who are recovering in the barracks who are seeing the quilts and then sort of relating the messages to others, maybe like you mentioned the rabbit, that's quite straightforward. But if the woman chose a more personal animal or object, anything to convey a message that only her husband would understand, that might have been lost even back then.
Totally.
So I think it's so interesting to think of this idea of several layers of code and how you have to learn how to read these objects. And again, I think this idea of resistance through embroidery, through textiles, because they're so soft, literally, and I think in the way we think of them, it's interesting because maybe they were considered not innocuous, but like less dangerous.
Totally.
And with what you mentioned with Mary Queen of Scots, maybe they were not as, I don't know, critical or controlling of her textile work as they were with her letters, right? So yeah, so maybe there's a kind of freedom in the material itself, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you. So the last person who I wanted to ask you about, I couldn't resist asking you about him. So it's this Brazilian artist, Arthur Bispo do Rosario, and so he was an Afro-Brazilian artist, right? Who I think was diagnosed with schizophrenia, right? And I believe he spent much of his life in psychiatric institutions, and he believed he could see angels, that he himself was Jesus Christ. And we have a museum dedicated to him in Brazil, as you know, and he made something called this Annunciation garment, which is a sort of cloak or poncho, right, with the names of all the women that he knew. And then thinking of Mary, Queen of Scots, because you mentioned how she used animals and plants from Conrad Gessner and like the books she had read to sort of bring the universe she knew, her reality, bring it back to her through her embroidery. I was thinking about Arthur Bispo do Rosario doing the same, because this idea of categorizing, appropriating, classifying the world around you through embroidery, I think it's so fascinating, like recording the world this way. And because I'm a Brazilian, I was really intrigued by his story. I think his work is just stunning. It's so impressive, and it's so, I don't know, it's just out of this world. It's incredible. And so I was thinking about this because we talked about slavery, we talked about prisons and prison camps and well, psychiatric institutions in this case. So I was thinking about this idea then of mental health or mental illness, psychiatric institutions, and this sort of idea of owning the world, like appropriating the world around you, because I think it's just such an interesting thread to pursue.
Absolutely. And I think I call it world building when it comes to people like Arthur Bispo do Rosario and Mary Queen of Scots, because you're right, they're cataloging and categorizing and encyclopediaizing. That's a word that I'm just going to make up. Their surroundings and also the world totally far beyond them, right? Like the way that Arthur Bispo do Rosario and Mary Queen of Scots differ in that is that Arthur Bispo de Rosario is listing everything that he knows. It's all the ships that he's seen. It's all the women that he knows. It's the train tracks and the ping pong tables and the bicycles in his life that he has seen. Whereas Mary Queen of Scots is using a book to reach way beyond these houses that she finds herself in, to go and see a turkey of America, a bird of America. It's like a turkey. And dolphins and all of these creatures that she would have never seen in her life. And I think it's for both of them and for many other people in this book and many people beyond the confines of these 12 stories, it's about giving yourself the world again in spaces where you are stuck behind walls of a psychiatric hospital or a prison or a house where you're under lock and key, or you're within the institution of enslavement. Your world has been forced to get really small, and it feels like by cataloging and categorizing what there is out there, what's out there in the world, that you're giving yourself the power to make the world big again. And we were just talking about connections between people, but I think it's also easy to forget that embroidery is also about connections to stuff and connections to your possessions. Embroidery itself is an object, it's material culture, but it has the capacity to illustrate and commemorate, the other rich little physical details of somebody's life. And it allows the maker, but also the people who study that making, like the people today who study this stuff, to rebuild an understanding of what that person's world would have looked like. So it's Arthur Bispo de Rosario world building as well as Mary Queen of Scots, but it's also us. It's about them also giving us the tools to build their worlds back up as well. I don't think they're doing that on purpose necessarily. I mean, Arthur Bispo de Rosario kind of is. It's his job, his mission from God is to replicate the entire world. I don't know if he would have thought that, 90 years later, 80 years later, we would have been talking about his garment in the way that we do. But whether it was their intention or not, the research that comes with studying these objects inevitably recreates the world building that they were endeavoring to undertake themselves.
Yeah,
I don't even know if that answered your question.
No, it does. It does, because I think especially this, it's such a powerful idea of not having your freedom. You kind of try to recreate the world so you get at least a sense of what the world actually is like. And I think it's interesting how in his case it seems to be more personal and more connected to his own experience, lived experience. Whereas with Mary, it seems to be more about broadening her world,
Yeah.
So, and I don't know, I think many of these objects are just so fascinating, and I'm glad that they're getting more attention in museums and exhibitions and people like you talking about them on, TikTok and social media in general. I think it's just really cool. And I think it's just such an important historical source in its own right. But even for people like me who study text, it can complement, it can add so many layers, And I think it's safe to say that embroidery is not just something that wealthy Victorian ladies did. I think I think that's the image we have to deconstruct. I think it's happening, and it's really cool to see. And I think especially the idea that people were embroidering, they were stitching, they were doing all this work under such difficult circumstances like prisons, mental health institutions, and whatnot. I wonder about this must have had. We spoke about reclaiming freedom, agency, but also it must have been about reclaiming a sort of agency, owning the narrative, but again, this sort of calming effect. It must have been so soothing, the repetitive activity. Maybe it's a way to pass the time as well. We didn't mention that, but I'm sure that was one of them. Definitely. One of the cases with, many of these people had loads of time, right? And being creative, expressing yourself. But I think it's interesting to see how all these layers from the personal and private to the public to the political, with elements of race and gender and class, they all come together through embroidery, and that's why I think it's so cool to be talking about this. So
thank you, and I agree.
And I think there are so many other stories in this book that we could explore, but people can go out and buy it and read it for themselves. It's worth it.
Thanks.
And but I just wanted to say that this has been such an interesting, such a fascinating, fun chat for me, and I've learned a lot. And I really do appreciate you taking the time to, walk me through your book, basically, because it's just such an interesting collection of people and stories. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to, I don't know, is that the right word? I think so, to be able to write about these people and to have people be interested and to be part of the movement of people getting people to care about embroidery. Because I'm obviously extremely biased, but you said it yourself, embroidery has the capacity to tell us so much about so many different types of people, and especially people on the margins. That's what we see in this book. Embroidery should be part of the conversation, I think, all the time, but especially when it comes to researching history, because it's a perfect complement to text, but also it oftentimes gives us answers or insights into the individuals who aren't in text at all.
Yeah.
And it's about, I don't know, it's one of the reasons I love embroidery. It's about bringing them back into the fold to understand, to read their embroidery like text, and to understand that they were communicating just in a way that was different than the written word or the published word or whatever, that their stories deserve to be told and talked about, and they should be celebrated in the same way that we celebrate books and paintings and everything in between. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to just chat embroidery and try to get people to care.
Thank you very much.